This isn't the first time Palestine lost everything overnight. In 1948, it was called Nakba. In 2023, they're calling it Nakba all over again. 85% of Gaza displaced again. But why does history keep repeating itself? The roots of today's conflict stretch back to a pivotal moment known as the Nakba. The Nakba is more than just a word in history books. It's the largest displacement of Palestinians since 1948. Yet, for many people around the world, it feels just like another distant headline. But then, why do so many Palestinians call the ongoing events not just a war, but the ongoing Nakba? To understand that term, we need to go back in history. Get ready, because what you're about to learn will surprise you. Moreover, understanding the history behind the Nakba is key to making sense of the current war and its deeper causes. From October 7, 2023, when Hamas launched a surprise attack on southern Israel, to the Israeli military's immediate and overwhelming response, Gaza has become the center of a humanitarian catastrophe. Over the next few weeks, neighborhoods in northern Gaza were flattened. The Al-Shifa hospital, Gaza's largest medical complex, was raided, and many smaller clinics were bombed or abandoned under heavy airstrikes. By the end of 2023, more than 28,000 Palestinian women and girls had reportedly lost their lives, with thousands more missing under the rubble. By February 2024, those numbers were higher. The World Food Programme warned of imminent famine-like conditions in parts of central and southern Gaza. It wasn't just the destruction, it was the displacement of lives. The Israeli military issued evacuation orders to civilians living in the north and parts of central Gaza, warning them to flee to the south for their safety. However, with nowhere truly safe, many found themselves fleeing again and again. People who left Beit Lahia found shelter in Khan Yunis, only to be bombed again. The cycle was endless, and by the middle of 2024, UNRWA estimated that 85% of Gaza's 2.3 million residents were now internally displaced, with most living in makeshift tents, school buildings, or the open desert. This wasn't a new situation with Palestinians, and that's where the word Nakba re-emerged. In native Arabic, Nakba means catastrophe, but in Palestinian history, it means the year when over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes during the creation of the State of Israel. Palestinian writer Rafat al-Arir, who was killed in an Israeli airstrike in late 2023, once wrote about what should be remembered of him when he dies in his last poem titled "If I Must Die." This is the language of the ongoing Nakba as used by Palestinians, echoed by human rights organizations, and formally acknowledged by United Nations officials, including Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. The majority of Gaza's population are the descendants of refugees from towns such as Ashkelon, Majdal, and Jaffa. These are the places their grandparents were forced to flee back in 1948, and many still hold keys to homes they never saw. And now, they are losing the homes they built in exile too. Back in 1948, the destruction was fast and extremely damaging, with many villages destroyed, houses looted, and families scattered. Today, the destruction in Gaza follows a similar template, but now it's caught live on camera and broadcast globally. At some point, numerous international protests were observed in countries such as London, Paris, Johannesburg, Jakarta, and New York, with millions calling for an immediate ceasefire. South Africa went even further to take the case to the International Court of Justice in early 2024, accusing Israel of committing genocide, a charge Israel boldly denied. The ICJ didn't rule on genocide, but ordered Israel to take all possible measures to prevent genocidal acts. In the United States, where public opinion began to shift, the Biden-led government maintained its support for Israel. President Biden, in a December 2023 speech, acknowledged the civilian casualties but said the United States could not support a ceasefire that leaves Hamas in power. But in all of these, what really happened in 1948? And what have we not understood so far about Israel and Palestine? Between April and July of 1948, nearly 400 Palestinian towns and villages were emptied by force and fear. Close to 1 million Palestinians became refugees in a matter of months. The Zionist paramilitary groups like the Irgun, Haganah, and the more radical Lehi allegedly played major roles in this operation. One of the most well-known incidents was the Deir Yassin massacre that happened on April 9, 1994. Over 100 men, women, and children were killed in the small village near Jerusalem by members of the Irgun and Lehi groups. In the town of Haifa, violence broke out in late April, and by May, tens of thousands of Arab residents were pushed back to the port or forced to flee by sea. In Jaffa, the second largest city in Palestine at the time, over 50,000 Palestinians were forced out, as many of them headed south towards Gaza or east into Jordan. By the time the State of Israel was officially declared on May 14, 1948, over half of the Arab population of Palestine had already been displaced. Historians like Ilan Pappé described them as part of Plan Dalet, a military strategy developed by the Haganah to secure key areas and remove Arab populations. Israel disputes using terms like ethnic cleansing, with the claim that many left voluntary or at the urging of Arab leaders. Villages were filled with dynamite after being emptied, even as religious houses were destroyed or repurposed. In places like Lida and Ramla, mass explosions were documented as the Israeli military marched out tens of thousands at gunpoint. Yet, the rest of the world's reaction was on mute. The US government, under President Truman, was among the first world powers to recognize the new state of Israel. Truman himself faced a lot of pressure from Zionist lobbies, especially in the months before the 1948 election. Supporting Israel, for many politicians in the West, was seen as morally just, especially after the horrors of what just happened during the Holocaust. But in doing so, the stories of the Palestinian land, homes, names, and lives were buried under the story of the birth of a new state. For every map drawn after 1948, there was a map erased. The establishment of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency was finalized by 1950 to handle such emergencies. In its first year, the Palestinian refugee population was said to have increased to nearly 900,000 people. The UNRWA continues to exist today, providing food and shelter to generations born in exile. However, Palestinians living in Gaza, the West Bank, and across occupied lands were not always displaced people without an identity. But what exactly was this identity? In nearly every Palestinian refugee home, no matter the country, be it a camp in Lebanon, a small flat in Amman, or a shelter in Rafah, you'll find a key. Not just any key, but one that's old, made of iron, and often too big for any modern lock. This key most often represents a house left behind in 1948, a home that may no longer exist. Still, Palestinians hold on to these keys as a reminder that they once belonged to a physical place that would have been their permanent home. The key has become one of the most visible and powerful symbols of the Nakba. The symbolism grew even stronger over time, as it was displayed on flags, graffiti, t-shirts, posters, and artwork throughout the region. In cities like Bethlehem, the Ada refugee camp built a massive gate in the shape of a key at its entrance, which is one of the first things you see when you walk into the camp. Yet, keys were not the only way their memory survived. Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, who was born in 1941 in the village of Al-Burra, destroyed in 1948, made memory a powerful tool of resistance. In Identity Card, he wrote lines like, "Write down, I am an Arab. I have a name without a title. My identity card number is 50,000. My roots are entrenched before the birth of time." Darwish's words eventually became a voice for millions, not because they were complex, but because they were simple, direct, and touching. They carried the voice of a people who had lost something they couldn't name, but could feel. In visual art too, the Nakba is never far. Palestinian artist Slimane Mansour painted a woman carrying the weight of the Holy Land on her back. Children equally learned these stories young through bedtime tales, family meals, or community events. In refugee camps across Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza, children were taught to memorize the names of their families' villages, even if they no longer appeared on maps. Many families still kept hand-drawn maps of their original homes. These were not official maps, but they were detailed and accurate. They were drawn from memory, often with the help of multiple family members, who compared their stories until a picture of home came together on paper. The attachment to memory became a core part of what it means to be a Palestinian. The land was lost, but the identity wasn't. Even in exile, even in statelessness, even when world leaders refused to recognize it, the people themselves never let it die. Till this day, May 15 is celebrated as Nakba Day annually among Palestinians, in which descendants still hold exhibitions and mourn the destruction of their land. Between 1948 and the early 1950s, over 400 Palestinian villages were systematically depopulated and either destroyed or repopulated by the new Israeli residents. The goal was not only to remove people, but also to erase the evidence that they had ever been there. One of the most well-known examples is the village of Deir Yassin, located just west of Jerusalem. After the massacre on April 9, in which over 100 villagers were killed by Zionist paramilitaries, the survivors fled. But not long after, new settlers arrived and the homes were repainted. Today, that area is part of a neighborhood called Givat Shaul. In Al-Birwa, the village where Mahmoud Darwish was born, the story is much the same. It was attacked in June 1948, retaken briefly by Arab forces, and then permanently captured by Israeli forces again. The land was later used for two new Israeli cooperative farming communities, Ahyad and Yasso. In 1965, the Jewish National Fund established numerous parks and forests on many of these ruins. It was called the Greening of Israel, but beneath the trees were broken stones, shattered wells, and the foundations of old homes. In Imwas, a village demolished during the 1967 war, became part of Canada Park and was funded by Canadian donations. Visitors today can walk through trees without any idea that hundreds of people once lived, farmed, and prayed there. When looked through the legal and bureaucratic lens, Israel's absentees property law, passed in 1950, allowed the government to take control of land and houses that were previously owned by Palestinians who fled or were expelled during the war. These properties were deemed abandoned and handed over to the state, and the former owners were never compensated nor allowed to return. In just a few years, the geographic map of Palestine was rewritten as towns like Jaffa and Haifa were emptied by their Arab majority. Entire areas were rebranded. Survivors returned in secret years later in a bid to find the graves of loved ones or what was left of their homes. What they found were new shopping malls, highways, or rows of homes they could no longer enter. The act of erasing is powerful because it doesn't just take away buildings, it also removes a great level of recognition. It makes it easier for others to forget, deny, or question whether these people were truly ever there. But the name of those villages still live on in songs, stories, and the memories carried by the children and grandchildren of those who once walked those streets. But this removal of the recognition of a people and the forceful removal from their reclaimed land created a bigger monster: resistance. How did this resistance form, and what exactly feeds it with the boldness and fearlessness of how it operates today? Let's find out. By the end of 1949, just 1 year after the Nakba, more than 750,000 Palestinians were already living as refugees, and within just a few more years, that number was up by nearly 900,000 more settlers scattered across Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. Most of these refugees lived in hastily assembled camps, and many of them still exist today. The early years were the hardest as those refugees began to live in canvas tents that offered little protection from the winter cold or summer heat. Food items such as flour, oil, and lentils were delivered in rations from international aid organizations. Over time, the tents were replaced by cement blocks, but those were meant to be temporary. However, generations have been born and raised in them. Today, most of the people living in those camps have never seen the towns or villages their grandparents came from. For many Palestinians, the statelessness defined their reality. They had no passports, only refugee cards issued by the UNRWA or temporary identity documents issued by their host countries. In Lebanon, for example, Palestinians could not legally work in dozens of professions, from medicine and law to engineering and banking. They were also restricted from owning property and faced difficulties enrolling in universities or public schools. This created a generation of educated, driven youth with limited opportunities and endless frustration. In Jordan, some Palestinians were able to get their citizenship after the annexation of the West Bank in 1950, but others, especially those from Gaza, remained in a legal limbo. In Syria, Palestinians were initially granted some rights but later became caught up in the country's internal conflicts. The outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011 devastated the Yarmouk camp, which had once housed over 150,000 Palestinians. By 2018, the camp was reduced to rubble after fierce battles involving both government forces and rebel groups. People fled in their thousands once again, with some becoming refugees for the second or third time in their lives. The experience of exile, hardship, and rejection by host societies fed a deep sense of injustice. For many Palestinians, the idea of resistance was not born out of ideology, but out of a deep, ongoing trauma. In a situation where many had no country, no citizenship, and no political power, resistance became the sole means of identity. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization was established in Cairo with the support of the Arab League. By 1969, Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Fatah, had taken control of the PLO, and the organization shifted from being a diplomatic voice to becoming the center of an armed struggle. It operated from refugee camps and carried out its operations against Israeli targets from Jordan, then Lebanon, and eventually from Tunisia after it was expelled. In Gaza, especially after the withdrawal of Israeli settlers in 2005, new groups like Hamas rose to power. Initially founded in 1987 during the first uprising, Hamas quickly positioned itself not only as a political party but as the religious and militant resistance movement. Many of its leaders were born in the refugee camps and had never lived a day outside of occupation or siege. The First Intifada, which took place from 1987 to 1993, was regarded as a grassroots uprising organized by civilians, students, and workers in the West Bank and Gaza. They threw stones, refused to cooperate with Israeli institutions, and created an alternative network of schools and healthcare. Eventually, this marked a turning point where resistance was no longer only from the outside, but was happening from within. But suddenly, a promise was made and all Palestinians thought this was finally the solution to the seemingly impossible problem. However, what was this promise? What became of it, and was it really fulfilled? Back on December 11, 1948, and just months after the last battles of the Nakba, the United Nations passed Resolution 194, which stated in clear language, refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. Israel opposed this resolution from the beginning, and that a mass return of Palestinians would undermine the new Jewish majority state, created just months earlier. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion believed the return would reopen another conflict and viewed the refugee situation as a result of war, not a wrong to be reversed. By 1950, Israel passed the Law of Return, which allowed Jews from anywhere in the world to immigrate to Israel and gain citizenship. Meanwhile, the original Palestinian residents who had fled just 2 years earlier were denied any entry. This meant a Jewish person in Poland or Ethiopia had more rights to the land than a Palestinian from Nazareth or Accra who still held the key to their family's front door. The right of return became the most enduring demand of the Palestinian people and the most painful point of disagreement in all negotiations. For most Palestinians, it was non-negotiable. For Israelis, however, it was seen as a threat to the very foundation of the state. The argument often came down to numbers. If millions of Palestinian refugees and their descendants were allowed back, Israel's Jewish majority could turn into a demographic minority. But the Palestinians never dropped the demand. In every peace talk, from Madrid in 1991 to Oslo in 1993 to Camp David in 2000, the right of return was always on the table and always rejected. In 2002, the Arab Peace Initiative, led by Saudi Arabia, offered Israel full recognition from 22 Arab states in exchange for withdrawal from occupied territories and a just solution to the refugee problem based on Resolution 194. Again, the offer fell through due to the return issue. Today, the number of registered Palestinian refugees under UNRWA has reached nearly 6 million, with many still holding documents that prove their origin and deeds to land in Haifa, Jama, Ramla, and Safed. Israel maintains that any solution must involve settling refugees elsewhere within future Palestinian borders or in host countries, but Palestinians say they were forced out. They never gave up their claim, and they see the right of return as something no politician nor diplomat can erase. In May 2023, during the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, the United Nations General Assembly held a special commemoration. It was the first time the UN officially marked the Nakba. In its speech, Palestinian officials reminded the world that they were not just statistics, but people with homes, histories, and rights. The Nakba is not just a memory, it's a living wound passed from generation to generation. As bombs fall and tents rise again, Palestinians are not simply fighting for land, but for recognition, dignity, and the right to return. The world often asks why peace is so elusive, but how can there be peace without justice, or return without acknowledgement? To end the Nakba is not only to stop war, it is to confront history, repair it, and finally listen to those whose voices have been silenced for 76 years. The question remains, how long can a people remain refugees in their own story? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.